Lily had never felt more alone in her life. At 9 years old, she already carried a weight heavier than most adults. She sat quietly on her small, creaky bed at St. Agnes Orphanage, the cold, stone walls surrounding her like a prison. The dim light from the window barely illuminated her world. The memories of the accident haunted her every night. The screeching tires, the explosion of glass, and then silence. It had been 6 months since the car crash. 6 long, painful months since she had lost her parents. But there was someone else who had disappeared that day. Her older sister, Ellie. Lily had always idolized Ellie. She was 6 years older, full of life, and always knew how to make her laugh, even in the toughest times. But on that terrible day, when the world seemed to crumble around them, Ellie vanished. The police said she was likely dead, but no body was ever found. Lily refused to believe it. "They're wrong," she whispered to herself, hugging her worn teddy bear tightly. "Ellie's still out there somewhere. I know it." Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside her door. It creaked open, revealing Mrs. Turner, the head of the orphanage, a stern woman with a perpetual frown etched on her face. "Lily," Mrs. Turner said flatly, "there's a charity event today. Put on something decent." Lily nodded, her heart sinking at the thought of yet another event where strangers came to pretend they cared about the orphans. They would hand out gifts, smile for the cameras, and leave, never thinking about them again. She hated those events. As she changed into her best dress, an old, faded blue gown that was a bit too big for her, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Her brown hair was tangled, and her eyes, once bright and full of wonder, now looked empty. "I'll find you, Ellie," she muttered. It was a promise she repeated to herself every day. Downstairs, the orphanage's common area had been transformed. Banners were hung, and tables overflowed with food and presents. Local businessmen and women, dressed in their finest clothes, mingled with the children, handing out smiles and sweets. Lily stayed in the corner, unnoticed. She didn't want their charity. She wanted answers. That's when she saw him. A tall man in a dark suit stood near the entrance, talking to one of the organizers. He seemed out of place in the crowded room, his expression calm, observing everything with sharp, focused eyes. He wasn't smiling like the others. There was something different about him. "Lily, come here." Mrs. Turner's voice barked from across the room, pulling her from her thoughts. Reluctantly, she approached. "This is Mr. Matthew Carter." Mrs. Turner introduced him with forced enthusiasm. "He's one of our most generous benefactors. He's here to help girls like you." Lily stared at him. There was something about his presence that made her feel uneasy, but not in a bad way. It was like he could see right through her. "Hello, Lily," Matthew said softly, bending down to her eye level. "It's nice to meet you." She nodded but didn't speak. Mrs. Turner's eyes narrowed, clearly expecting her to behave more appropriately, but Lily didn't care. She wasn't interested in exchanging pleasantries. Mr. Carter watched her for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope, offering it to her. "For the orphanage," he explained, handing it to Mrs. Turner. But Lily didn't look at the envelope. Instead, in a voice trembling with emotion, she asked, "Can you help me find my sister?" Both Mrs. Turner and Matthew froze. "My sister, Ellie," Lily continued. Her eyes brimming with tears, she fought hard to keep from falling. "She disappeared when they died. They never found her. Everyone says she's gone, but I don't believe them. Can you help me find her?" The room seemed to quiet, the distant laughter and chatter fading as Matthew's gaze locked onto hers. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something deeper than pity. "Please," Lily whispered. "I just need to know." For a moment, Matthew said nothing, his expression unreadable. But then, he did something unexpected. He nodded. "I'll see what I can do," he said quietly, his voice firm, almost like a promise. Lily blinked in surprise. No one had ever taken her seriously before. Most adults dismissed her as a child with wild, unrealistic hopes. But this man, he seemed different. Mrs. Turner, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, quickly ushered Matthew away. "She's had a hard time, Mr. Carter. You understand. Children make up stories to cope." But Matthew wasn't listening. His eyes lingered on Lily as he was led away, and for the first time in a long while, a spark of hope ignited in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, someone finally believed her. The charity event came and went, but Lily couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Carter. His calm voice, the way he didn't dismiss her request like all the others, it was enough to light a fire inside her. Maybe, for the first time since the accident, she had found someone who would help. Days passed. The orphanage returned to its usual routine of quiet meals, shared chores, and endless silence. Lily watched from the window every afternoon, hoping to see Matthew return. She didn't tell anyone, not even the other kids. It was her secret, her only hope, and she held on to it tightly. One cold morning, a knock at the door interrupted breakfast. Mrs. Turner, always annoyed by anything outside her rigid schedule, stormed across the room to open it. Lily looked up from her bowl of porridge, her heart leaping. Standing in the doorway was Matthew Carter. He looked different this time, dressed more casually in a dark sweater and coat. He wasn't here to make donations or smile for photographs. This time, his eyes scanned the room, and when he saw Lily, a small nod passed between them. "Lily," Mrs. Turner said, raising an eyebrow as she looked between them. "Mr. Carter would like to speak with you. Don't take too long. You have chores." Lily didn't wait for a second invitation. She slipped from her chair and followed Matthew out of the dining hall, the eyes of the other children following her curiously. They stepped outside into the chilly air. The orphanage's courtyard was small and surrounded by old brick walls, offering little in the way of comfort or warmth. But Matthew led her over to a bench by the side, where they could talk without prying ears. He sat down, and for a moment, there was silence. Lily felt nervous, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress as she looked at him, unsure of what to say. "Lily," Matthew began, his voice soft but serious, "I've been thinking about what you said. About your sister." Lily's heart pounded in her chest. No one ever brought up Ellie. Not the police, not the social workers, not even Mrs. Turner. It was as if everyone had decided to forget she ever existed. "I've started looking into it," he continued, his eyes watching her closely. "But I need more information. Can you tell me anything else? Anything you remember from that day?" Lily swallowed, her mouth dry. She had gone over the details 1,000 times in her head, but no one had ever asked her to say them out loud before. She took a deep breath. "We were in the car," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "Mom and Dad were arguing about something. I don't remember what. Ellie was sitting in the back with me. She had her headphones on, listening to music. Then there was this truck. It came out of nowhere." Lily closed her eyes, the memory rushing back, vivid and terrifying. The car flipped. I remember screaming. When it stopped, there was glass everywhere. I was hurt, but I could still see Ellie. She wasn't in her seat anymore. She was outside on the road. But then, someone came. A man, I think. I saw him, just for a second. He picked her up. Then they were gone. Tears stung Lily's eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to cry. The police said it was the shock. They told me I must have imagined it. But I didn't, she said, her voice firm now. "I know what I saw." Matthew sat quietly for a moment, processing her words. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a mix of understanding and determination. "Lily," he said slowly, "I believe you." Those 3 words hit her like a wave. She looked up at him, her heart pounding, afraid to believe it. "You do?" He nodded. "I've looked at the reports, and something doesn't add up. The timeline is strange, and there are gaps in the investigation. If Ellie was taken, it would explain a lot." Lily felt a surge of hope. Then, "What do we do? How do we find her?" Matthew hesitated for a moment, glancing around the courtyard as if weighing his next words carefully. When he spoke again, his voice was low, almost like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "I'll keep investigating. There are people I can talk to, connections I can use. But it might take time," he warned. "And it might not be safe." Lily's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Matthew looked directly at her. "If someone took Ellie, they wouldn't want anyone finding out. That means there are people who might try to stop us. We have to be careful. A cold chill ran down her spine. It wasn't the answer she had expected, but she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She had waited 6 months, desperate and alone, and now, finally, someone was listening. I don't care, she said, her voice steady. I'll do whatever it takes. Matthew gave her a small, approving nod. All right then, we'll start with what we know. I'll look into the accident reports, see if I can track down anyone who was there that day. But you have to stay strong. Stay out of trouble here. Lily nodded quickly. I will. He stood up, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. I'll be back in a few days. And Lily, if anyone asks, don't mention any of this. Not yet. I won't, she promised. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing through the gates of the orphanage. Lily stood there for a moment, her mind racing. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. The search for Ellie had finally begun. Days turned into weeks, and the cold grip of winter began to tighten around the orphanage. The children spent most of their time indoors, huddled near the fireplaces in the common rooms, while Mrs. Turner seemed to grow more irritable with each passing day. But Lily had a secret now, one that kept her going even as the bleakness of her surroundings threatened to swallow her whole. Every night, as she lay on her small, uncomfortable bed, she thought about Ellie. She pictured her sister's face, her warm smile, the way she used to braid Lily's hair, and every night, she whispered the same words to herself. Matthew is looking for her. He'll find her, She clung to that hope like a lifeline, replaying the conversation she had with Matthew over and over in her head. He had promised to investigate, to dig deeper into the accident. He believed her, and that was all she needed to keep going. But then one evening, just after dinner, something unexpected happened. Lily, Mrs. Turner called from across the dining hall, her voice sharp as usual. Come here. Lily looked up from her plate, her heart sinking. Mrs. Turner never called for her unless something bad was coming. Slowly, she stood and made her way across the room, the eyes of the other children following her, filled with curiosity and pity. When she reached Mrs. Turner, the woman handed her a folded note. This came for you. Lily blinked in surprise. For me. Mrs. Turner's lips tightened into a thin line, clearly disapproving of whatever was written inside. Read it and be quick about it. You still have chores. Lily nodded, took the note, and hurried off to a quiet corner of the room. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the paper. It was a short message, written in neat, careful handwriting. Meet me outside the gate at midnight. Come alone. MC. Her heart skipped a beat. Matthew Carter. He was back. She carefully folded the note and slipped it into her pocket, trying to keep her expression neutral as she returned to her chores. But inside, her mind was racing. Why was he coming so late? What had he found out? That night, Lily barely slept. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the hours to pass. The orphanage was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old building settling in the wind. When the clock finally struck midnight, she slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the other girls. She moved silently through the dark hallways, her bare feet making no sound against the cold, wooden floors. Reaching the back door, she slowly turned the handle and stepped outside. The night air was freezing, and a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the ground with a thin layer of white. Lily pulled her thin coat tighter around her and hurried across the courtyard to the main gate. There, standing in the shadows just beyond the iron bars, was Matthew. You came, he said quietly, stepping forward as she approached. I said I would, Lily replied, her breath visible in the cold air. What did you find? Is it about Ellie? Matthew glanced around, making sure no one was watching. I found something, he said, lowering his voice. But it's complicated. Lily frowned. What do you mean? He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck as if he wasn't sure how to begin. I looked into the accident reports, talked to some of the officers who were there that day. There's no mention of your sister in the official records after the crash. No hospital visits, no witnesses seeing her. Nothing. Lily's heart sank. So, what are you saying? That she really is gone? Matthew shook his head. No, I don't think that's it. I found something strange, something they didn't put in the public records. He pulled a small folder from his coat and handed it to her. Inside were copies of old documents, police reports, medical forms, and photographs of the crash site. One photo caught her attention immediately: the wreckage of her family's car, with the surrounding area taped off. In the corner of the picture, blurred but visible, was a man. He was standing far from the wreck, barely noticeable in the background, but something about him seemed off. "Who is that?" Lily asked, pointing to the figure. "That's what I'm trying to find out," Matthew replied. "He wasn't listed in any of the police reports, and none of the officers I talked to remember seeing him. But he was there, watching." Lily stared at the photo, her mind racing. "Do you think he took her?" "Ellie, I don't know," Matthew said honestly, "but it's possible. Someone went through a lot of trouble to make sure her disappearance was overlooked. If that man was involved, it means this isn't just an accident. It's something much bigger." Lily's hands shook as she held the folder. "What do we do now?" Matthew crouched down to her level, his face serious. "We keep looking. I have some contacts who can help us dig deeper, but it's dangerous, Lily. Whoever covered this up doesn't want the truth coming out." "I don't care," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. "I want to find her." Matthew nodded. "Then we'll do it together. But you have to be careful. Don't tell anyone about this, not even the other kids. If someone finds out what we're doing, it could put you in danger." Lily's stomach twisted, but she nodded. "I understand." He stood up, his eyes scanning the area one last time before turning back to her. "I'll be in touch soon. Keep an eye out for another note." As he started to leave, Lily called out, "Wait, what if they come after me?" Matthew stopped, his expression softening. "They won't," he said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." With that, he disappeared into the night, leaving Lily standing by the gate, clutching the folder tightly to her chest. The cold wind bit at her face as she hurried back to the orphanage, her mind swirling with everything Matthew had told her. There were people who didn't want the truth about Ellie to come out, people who might be watching her even now. But as she slipped back into bed and pulled the blankets up to her chin, one thought kept repeating in her mind. "I'm closer to finding her. I'm closer than I've ever been." Lily felt different the next morning. As she sat at the breakfast table, pushing her oatmeal around with her spoon, the usual sounds of the orphanage, the clattering dishes, the murmurs of conversation, seemed distant, almost muted. Her thoughts were consumed by the folder Matthew had given her, the blurry image of the man standing at the crash site. Who was he? What did he want with Ellie? And why had no one noticed him before? The other children sat around her, oblivious to the storm swirling inside her mind. Mrs. Turner bustled about, giving orders as usual, her stern face casting disapproving glances at anyone who didn't eat quickly enough. But Lily barely noticed. Her world had shifted overnight, and now nothing felt the same. She kept her head down, not wanting to attract attention, especially from Mrs. Turner. The folder was hidden under her mattress, a secret she guarded fiercely. Every so often, she glanced toward the window, wondering when Matthew would contact her again. She didn't have to wait long. Later that afternoon, after lunch, one of the younger girls, Molly, came running up to Lily in the hallway, her small face flushed with excitement. "Lily, Mrs. Turner said you have a visitor," she chirped, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. A visitor? Lily's heart skipped. It had to be Matthew. She quickly made her way to the front entrance, trying to keep her pace calm despite the urgency she felt. When she stepped into the room, her eyes immediately found him. Matthew stood near the door, speaking with Mrs. Turner, who seemed to be in one of her usual sour moods. "Lily, there you are," Mrs. Turner said, her tone clipped. "Mr. Carter has come to speak with you again. Don't take too long. You've got chores to finish." Lily nodded quickly, eager to get away from her watchful eyes. Matthew gave her a reassuring smile and motioned for her to follow him outside. As soon as they were clear of the building, Lily could feel the weight of Mrs. Turner's presence lift. They walked in silence for a few moments, heading toward the same bench where they had spoken before. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the threat of snow, but Matthew seemed focused, his usual calm demeanor replaced with something more urgent. I found something, he said, sitting down. Something I wasn't expecting. Lily sat beside him, her breath quickening. What is it? Matthew took a deep breath, his expression serious. I went back through some old records, ones that weren't included in the police report. I found out that someone was making payments to a private investigator around the time of the accident. Large payments. And the name on those transactions was your father. Lily's brow furrowed. My dad? But why? What does that mean? I don't know yet, Matthew admitted, his voice tense. But it's strange. Very few people knew about those payments. They were trying to keep something hidden. I think your father was looking for something, or someone, long before the accident. Lily felt a chill run down her spine. You think he was looking for Ellie? But why wouldn't he have told us? Matthew looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of sympathy and confusion. I don't know, but it means there's more going on here than just the accident. Your family might have been involved in something much bigger. Lily's thoughts raced. Her father? Involved in something secret? It didn't make sense. Her dad had been quiet, reserved, but always kind and loving. He worked long hours, but when he was home, he was present. He had been so devoted to them, to Ellie especially. What could he have been hiding? Does this mean someone else might be looking for Ellie too? She asked, her voice trembling with the possibility. Matthew nodded. It's possible. If your father was searching for her, there's a chance someone didn't want him to find out the truth. Lily felt a wave of fear wash over her. What if they're still out there? What if they're trying to stop us too? Matthew's expression darkened. That's what I'm worried about. Whoever this is, they've been covering their tracks for a long time. If we get too close, they might come after us. Lily's heart pounded in her chest. The fear was real now, tangible. It wasn't just a far-off hope that Ellie was alive. It was the realization that someone, somewhere, didn't want her found. And now, by searching for her, they were stepping into dangerous territory. What do we do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Matthew leaned forward, his voice low and firm. We stay careful. I've contacted someone I trust, an old friend who used to work in law enforcement. He's discreet, and he can help us dig deeper without drawing attention. But Lily, you need to be extra cautious now. Don't talk to anyone about this. Not the other kids, not Mrs. Turner. No one. I won't, she promised, her fear solidifying into determination. I just want to find Ellie. Matthew gave her a small, reassuring smile. We will. But we have to do this the right way. Slow and quiet. We can't let whoever's behind this know we're onto them. Lily nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. She had always been willing to do whatever it took to find Ellie, but now the stakes felt higher. There were people involved, dangerous people, who didn't want her sister found, but that only made her more determined. I'll be careful, she said again, more to herself than to Matthew. He stood, glancing toward the orphanage to make sure no one was watching. I'll be in touch again soon. Until then, just keep your head down. And if anything strange happens, if you notice anything out of the ordinary, let me know immediately. Lily nodded again, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. Okay. Matthew gave her one last look, his eyes serious but filled with a quiet confidence. We're getting closer, Lily. I can feel it. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the narrow alley beside the orphanage. Lily stood there for a moment, the cold air biting at her skin, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She wasn't just a little girl looking for her sister anymore. She was part of something bigger, something dangerous, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. But as she turned back toward the orphanage, a new resolve hardened inside her. Whatever this was, whatever secret had torn her family apart and taken Ellie away, she would find the truth. She would face it, no matter how terrifying it was. Lily hurried back inside, her mind spinning with everything Matthew had told her. She knew now that the road ahead was dangerous, but there was no turning back. She had to find Ellie, no matter what. The days dragged on in a strange, tense silence. Lily went about her usual chores at the orphanage, but everything felt different now. Every step, every glance over her shoulder, made her feel like someone was watching. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving faster than she could keep up, and the weight of the secret she carried was growing heavier with each passing day. Matthew's warning stayed fresh in her mind. Be careful. Stay quiet. Don't trust anyone. It had been a week since their last meeting, and no new note had arrived. She tried not to let the growing silence gnaw at her, but it was hard. At night, she lay awake in bed, staring up at the ceiling, wondering what Matthew had found, wondering if whoever had taken Ellie knew they were getting closer. One evening, as Lily was helping clean up after dinner, the faint buzz of a conversation nearby caught her attention. Mrs. Turner was standing in the hallway, talking to someone on the phone. Her voice, usually stern and unyielding, was now hushed, almost tense. Lily froze, her ears straining to catch fragments of the conversation. Yes, I've kept a close eye on her. No, there hasn't been anything unusual. You'll let me know if there's any change? Lily's heart skipped a beat. Who was Mrs. Turner talking about? Was it her? Did someone suspect she was working with Matthew? She carefully backed away, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she had overheard. If Mrs. Turner was involved in all of this, it meant danger was much closer than she'd thought. That night, as the other girls in the dormitory slept, Lily crept to the window, peering out into the moonlit courtyard. Her breath fogged up the cold glass as she scanned the dark shadows for any sign of movement. She couldn't shake the growing fear that someone was out there, watching, waiting. The next morning, Lily was scrubbing the floors in the common room when Mrs. Turner approached her, her face unreadable. "Lily," she said sharply, "there's someone here to see you." Lily's heart leapt, but she kept her expression neutral. It had to be Matthew. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, and followed Mrs. Turner toward the front door. But when they reached the entrance, it wasn't Matthew standing there. It was a woman Lily had never seen before. She was tall, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything with a single glance. Her long black coat was buttoned tightly, and she carried an air of authority that made Lily instantly uneasy. "This is Ms. Harper," Mrs. Turner said, her voice unusually stiff. "She's here to ask you a few questions, Lily." Lily's stomach twisted into a knot. Questions? About what? Ms. Harper smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, just a few routine things. It won't take long." Lily shot a glance at Mrs. Turner, who stood with her arms crossed, watching her closely. There was something off about all of this. She knew instinctively that whatever this was, it wasn't routine. I don't know what I can tell you," Lily said, her voice steady but cautious. Ms. Harper stepped closer, her eyes locking onto Lily's. "It's just about your sister, Ellie. I understand you've been asking questions about her." Lily's breath caught in her throat. "They knew. I just wanted to know what happened to her," Lily said, trying to sound as innocent as possible. "No one's told me anything." Ms. Harper nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Lily's face. "I see. It's understandable for a young girl to be curious, but some things are better left alone." Lily's heart pounded in her chest. There was no mistaking the warning in her voice. She forced herself to meet Ms. Harper's gaze, despite the fear twisting inside her. "I just want to find her," Lily said quietly. "I don't understand why it's such a big deal." Ms. Harper's expression tightened slightly. "You're a smart girl, Lily. You should know when to stop looking for answers that might hurt you." The room felt colder, the air around them thick with tension. Mrs. Turner stood by, silent but watching, her eyes flickering between Lily and Ms. Harper. The weight of their stares made Lily feel trapped, like a mouse caught in a corner. "I don't know anything else," Lily finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just trying to understand what happened." Ms. Harper studied her for a long moment, then finally took a step back, her cold smile returning. "Of course. I'm sure you'll let us know if you remember anything unusual." Lily nodded quickly, feeling the need to escape the room as soon as possible. "Yes, ma'am." Ms. Harper glanced at Mrs. Turner, who gave a curt nod, before turning and leaving the orphanage without another word. The door closed behind her with a sharp click, and the tension in the room seemed to lift slightly. Lily stood frozen in place, her mind spinning. Who was Ms. Harper? And how much did she know? Mrs. Turner stepped forward, her face stern. "You're not to speak with her again, understand? This is a delicate matter, and you've already caused enough trouble. Lily felt the sting of the words, but she knew better than to argue. She nodded and quickly excused herself, retreating to her room. As soon as she was alone, she collapsed onto her bed, her heart still racing. She pulled the folder Matthew had given her from its hiding spot beneath the mattress, flipping through the papers again, searching for any clue, any piece of the puzzle that might explain what was happening. Her father's name on those payments, the man in the photograph at the crash site, and now this strange woman asking questions. It was all connected somehow. But how? And more importantly, why? Lily closed the folder and hugged it tightly to her chest, her thoughts racing. Matthew had said they were getting closer. But now, it seemed that the people trying to stop them were closing in too. She had to find Matthew, tell him about Ms. Harper, about the questions, about the veiled threats. But how? She couldn't risk leaving the orphanage and drawing more attention. And what if Mrs. Turner was watching her more closely now? That night, as the wind howled outside the orphanage windows, Lily lay awake, staring at the ceiling once again. But this time, the fear felt heavier. She was no longer just searching for answers about her sister. She was being hunted for them. The atmosphere at St. Agnes Orphanage had changed, and Lily could feel it with every step she took. Mrs. Turner watched her more closely now, her sharp eyes lingering longer than usual whenever Lily passed by. The other children were oblivious to the tension, still going about their daily routines, laughing and playing in the yard. But Lily felt the cold weight of suspicion hanging over her like a dark cloud. Ms. Harper's warning replayed in her mind constantly. Some things are better left alone. The way she'd said it, the coldness in her voice, had made it clear that this was more than just an inquiry. They were getting closer to the truth, and whoever Ms. Harper worked for didn't like it. But Lily wasn't going to stop. She couldn't. 2 days after Ms. Harper's visit, Lily received another note. It was tucked under her pillow when she returned from the dining hall, carefully folded and barely noticeable. Her heart raced as she unfolded it, her hands trembling. Asterisk, meet me at the old park bench behind the church. Midnight. Come alone. MC. Asterisk, the old park behind the church was rarely used, especially at night. It was perfect for a secret meeting. Lily stared at the note, torn between excitement and fear. Matthew must have found something. But the last meeting hadn't gone unnoticed, and now she had to be more cautious than ever. That night, as the orphanage grew quiet and the lights were turned out, Lily lay in bed, waiting for the clock to strike midnight. The usual creaks of the old building settled around her, but her nerves made every sound feel sharper, every movement more threatening. Finally, when the house was still, she slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the other girls. She moved through the dark hallways with the same quiet precision as before, slipping out the back door into the cold night air. The wind was biting, and the sky above was overcast, hiding the moon and stars. It made the night feel even darker, the shadows deeper. Lily hurried through the orphanage courtyard, her breath visible in the icy air. The church was only a few blocks away, and the closer she got, the more her heart pounded. Every step seemed louder than it should have been, as if the night was conspiring to give her away. When she reached the small park behind the church, she paused at the entrance, scanning the empty space. The trees cast long, twisted shadows across the ground, and the old wooden bench sat in the middle of the clearing, half hidden by darkness. Matthew was already there, sitting quietly, his figure barely visible in the dim light. Lily took a deep breath and stepped forward, her feet crunching softly in the thin layer of snow that had fallen earlier in the day. "You made it," Matthew said quietly as she approached, his voice low but calm. Lily nodded, her breath catching in her throat. "What did you find? Is it about Ellie?" Matthew's expression was grim. He waited until she sat down next to him before speaking again. "I've been digging deeper, following the money trail connected to your father's payments. It's worse than I thought." Lily's stomach churned. "Worse? How?" Matthew leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice dropping even lower. "Your father wasn't just making payments to a private investigator. He was involved in something bigger, something dangerous. The payments were part of a deal, and it looks like he was trying to buy his way out of it." Lily's heart pounded in her ears. "A deal? What kind of deal?" Matthew hesitated, glancing around to make sure they were still alone. It's complicated, but from what I've pieced together, your father was involved with a group, people with power, connections. Whatever they were involved in, your father got too close to something, and they didn't want him to. I think Ellie might have been part of it. Lily felt the world shift beneath her feet. Her father? Involved with dangerous people? It didn't make any sense. My dad wasn't like that. He wouldn't have. I know it's hard to believe, Matthew interrupted gently, but the evidence is there. I don't think he had a choice. He was trying to protect your family, and when the accident happened, I think they took Ellie as leverage. Lily's breath caught in her throat. Leverage? You mean they took her to keep him quiet? Matthew nodded. That's what it looks like. I don't know the full details yet, but your father was trying to get out. That much is clear. Lily's mind spun, her thoughts colliding with each other. It didn't seem real. Her father had been protecting them? From what? From who? What do we do now? She asked, her voice small and uncertain. Matthew looked at her, his expression serious. We need to find out who's behind this. I have a few leads, but it's going to take time. And it's dangerous, Lily. These people are watching. Miss Harper is just the beginning. They know we're getting close. The mention of Miss Harper sent a shiver down Lily's spine. She came to the orphanage, she said quietly. She warned me to stop looking. She knows something. Matthew's eyes darkened. That's what I was afraid of. They're trying to scare you. They think if they put enough pressure on you, you'll back off. Lily clenched her fists. I'm not backing off. I want to find Ellie. Matthew nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. Good. But we need to be smart about this. From now on, we can't meet as often. It's too risky. I'll send messages when I have something new, but you have to stay careful. I will, Lily promised, though the fear in her chest was hard to ignore. She knew the danger was real now. Miss Harper's cold, piercing gaze had left no doubt in her mind that these people were watching, waiting for any misstep. Matthew stood, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. There's one more thing, he said, his voice dropping even lower. I don't think Ellie's the only one they've taken. There might be others. If we can find out where they're holding her, we might be able to help more than just your sister. Lily's eyes widened. Other kids? You think they've done this before? Matthew nodded grimly. It's possible. These people don't just disappear one girl. They've been doing this for years, and your father. He got too close to uncovering the truth. Lily felt her pulse quicken. The thought of other children, scared and alone, hidden away somewhere, made her blood run cold. She had to find Ellie, but now she had to find the others too. She stood up beside Matthew, the weight of everything settling on her shoulders. What happens next? She asked, her voice small but determined. Matthew looked at her, his face hard with resolve. We find out who's behind this, and we stop them. Lily nodded, her fear replaced by a fierce determination. She had no idea what lay ahead, but she wasn't going to stop. Ellie was out there somewhere, and now she knew that there were others who needed help too. I'll wait for your message, she said, turning to leave. Lily, Matthew called softly, stopping her just before she disappeared into the night. Be careful. They won't hesitate to come after you if they think you're a threat. Lily met his gaze, her expression steady. I will be. As she made her way back to the orphanage, the wind howling around her, Lily felt a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her sister anymore. This was bigger than she had ever imagined, and she was right in the middle of it. But she wouldn't be afraid. She couldn't afford to be. She was going to find Ellie, and nothing, not a mess. Harper, not the shadows that followed her every move, was going to stop her. The following days at the orphanage felt like a blur to Lily. She moved through her chores and routines like a ghost, her mind always somewhere else, on Ellie, on Matthew's warnings, and on the disturbing possibility that other children were also being kept somewhere, hidden from the world. The weight of it all pressed down on her, but she refused to let fear paralyze her. Mrs. Turner's watchful eyes were ever present, and Lily had learned to sense them even when she wasn't looking. Miss Harper's visit had made things worse, and Lily knew they were waiting for her to slip up. But she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. One afternoon, while the other children played outside in the yard, Lily sat by the window, watching the falling snow swirl gently in the wind. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from behind. She didn't have to turn around to know it was Mrs. Turner. "Lily," Mrs. Turner's sharp voice broke the silence. "I've got a new assignment for you." Lily forced herself to stay calm, to keep her expression neutral as she turned to face her. "Yes, Mrs. Turner? You're to clean the storage room in the basement," Mrs. Turner said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's been left a mess, and I expect you to have it done before dinner." Lily's heart sank. The storage room in the basement was one of the most dreaded places in the orphanage. Dark, cold, and filled with forgotten odds and ends no one cared about. She had never been sent down there before, but she knew it was a task given as punishment or to keep someone out of sight for a while. "Understood," Lily said quietly, knowing there was no use in arguing. Mrs. Turner gave her a curt nod and walked away, leaving Lily with a sense of unease. Something about this didn't feel right. Why send her down there now, of all times? Was it just a coincidence, or was this their way of isolating her? Pushing aside the knot of worry in her stomach, Lily made her way to the basement. The door creaked as she opened it, revealing a narrow, winding staircase that led down into the dimly lit lower level. The air grew colder as she descended, the stone walls feeling damp and oppressive. At the bottom of the stairs, she found the storage room, its door slightly ajar. She pushed it open, revealing a cluttered space filled with old furniture, boxes of files, broken toys, and unused equipment. Dust hung in the air, and the small window near the ceiling let in only a sliver of gray light. She hesitated for a moment, feeling the cold seeping into her bones, but then forced herself to get to work. She began by moving the heavier items aside, stacking old chairs against the far wall and clearing a path through the mess. As she worked, her thoughts drifted back to Matthew's last warning. Asterisk, these people are watching. We have to be smart, asterisk. The silence of the basement pressed down on her, broken only by the occasional creak of the building above. As she moved a stack of boxes to the side, one of them tipped over, spilling its contents across the floor. Papers scattered everywhere, and Lily sighed, bending down to gather them up. That's when she noticed something unusual. One of the files that had fallen open contained old documents, faded and yellowed with age. But it wasn't the age of the papers that caught her attention. It was the name written at the top. Eleanor Whitfield. Lily's breath caught in her throat. Ellie's name. Her hands trembled as she picked up the file, her heart pounding in her chest. She quickly scanned the document, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't a normal orphanage record. These were medical files, old records from a hospital. But why were they down here, hidden away in the basement? Her mind raced with questions. Was this why Mrs. Turner had sent her down here? Did they know she would find it? Lily flipped through the pages, her eyes widening with every line she read. The documents mentioned Ellie by name, but the details were vague and incomplete. There were notes about further evaluation needed and classified status, followed by a series of appointments that seemed to stop abruptly. The last page had a date, just 2 weeks before the accident. What was Ellie being evaluated for? Why had these documents been hidden down here? A noise from behind made Lily freeze. Footsteps. She quickly shoved the file back into the box, her heart hammering in her chest. The footsteps grew louder, echoing down the stairwell. She ducked behind a large stack of chairs, crouching low, just as the door creaked open. "Lily?" Mrs. Turner's voice called out, cold and sharp. "I know you're down here." Lily held her breath, her body tense, trying to stay as quiet as possible. She could hear Mrs. Turner's footsteps entering the room, slow and deliberate, as if she was searching for something or someone. "Lily," she called again, her tone more dangerous now. "You're not supposed to be hiding." Lily bit her lip, praying Mrs. Turner wouldn't find her. She couldn't let her know she had found the file. She couldn't let them know she was one step closer to discovering the truth. After a few tense moments, the footsteps retreated, and the door closed with a soft click. Lily waited, her heart pounding in her ears, before daring to move. Slowly, she stood up from her hiding spot, her mind racing. She knew now that something was deeply wrong in this orphanage. Ellie's files had been hidden for a reason, and Mrs. Turner was part of it. But how deep did this go? And how much more was being kept from her? Grabbing the file and hiding it under her sweater, Lily made her way back upstairs, her mind spinning. She couldn't confront Mrs. Turner yet, not without knowing more. But now she had a new piece of the puzzle, one that could bring her closer to finding Ellie. She had to get this information to Matthew. Back in her room, she carefully stashed the file beneath her mattress, her hands still shaking. She would find a way to slip out and meet Matthew as soon as possible. But until then, she had to act as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't discovered the first real clue to where her sister might be. Lily sat on her bed, staring at the wall, her pulse still racing. The truth was closer now. She could feel it, but so was the danger. And whatever was hidden in those files, whatever secrets her father had been trying to protect them from, they weren't going to stay buried for much longer. Lily barely slept that night. The discovery of Ellie's medical files haunted her, making it impossible to rest. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day over and over. Why had those documents been hidden? And what did they mean? The vague references to evaluations and classified status sent a chill through her. As dawn broke, she knew she had to get the information to Matthew. But the more she thought about it, the more dangerous it seemed. Mrs. Turner had already shown up in the basement, and it was clear they were watching her closely now. She had to be smart, careful, just like Matthew had warned. The next day, Lily went about her usual routine, pretending that everything was normal. But inside, her heart was racing. She kept her movements measured, her eyes downcast, not wanting to give away any hint that she was planning something. Every time she passed Mrs. Turner in the hallway, she forced herself to look calm, even though fear pulsed through her veins. Finally, when the afternoon came and the other children went outside to play, Lily slipped away unnoticed. She darted through the orphanage, moving as quickly and quietly as she could, and made her way to the back door. Her pulse quickened as she stepped outside, feeling the cold air hit her face. She made her way toward the old park behind the church where she and Matthew had met before. Snow crunched under her feet as she hurried along the quiet, empty streets. The wind was biting, and her thin coat did little to keep the chill away, but Lily didn't care. She was too focused on getting to Matthew. When she reached the park, she was relieved to see Matthew waiting on the same bench. His eyes were scanning the area, always cautious. But when he saw Lily approach, his expression softened. "You made it," he said, standing up as she reached him. Lily nodded, glancing around to make sure no one had followed her. "I found something," she said quickly, her voice low and urgent. "In the basement of the orphanage, I found Ellie's file." Matthew's eyes sharpened with interest. "Ellie's file? What kind of file?" "It's medical records," Lily explained, pulling the folded papers from her coat pocket. "I don't understand all of it, but it's from before the accident. It mentions evaluations and something classified, but I don't know what it means." Matthew took the papers from her, his brow furrowing as he scanned the documents. The cold air hung between them as he read, and Lily watched his expression shift from confusion to concern. "This is big," Matthew said after a few moments. "These aren't normal medical files. If they were, they wouldn't have been hidden away like this." Lily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Do you know what they mean?" Matthew shook his head, but his voice was grim. "Not entirely, but I've seen things like this before. Classified status usually means someone higher up was involved. Government, maybe. It could be why they took her. If Ellie was part of some kind of experiment or program, they'd want to keep it quiet." Lily's heart skipped a beat. "An experiment? You think they did something to her?" Matthew looked at her, his face serious. "It's possible. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but if your father was trying to get out of whatever this was, it could explain why they took Ellie. She might have been a key part of whatever they were involved in." Lily's mind raced. The thought of Ellie being used in some kind of secret experiment, of being taken away because of it, filled her with fear and anger. But at the same time, it also gave her hope. If they had taken Ellie because she was important to them, then maybe she was still alive. Maybe she was still out there, waiting to be found. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Matthew folded the papers carefully and tucked them into his coat. "I'll dig into this. I have some contacts who might be able to help us figure out what these evaluations were. But we have to move carefully. If these people know we're onto them, they'll try to shut us down. Hard. Lily swallowed, her fear rising again. And Mrs. Turner, she's watching me. I think she knows something. She sent me to the basement, and I'm pretty sure she was hoping I wouldn't find the files. Matthew nodded, his jaw tightening. We can't trust anyone in that orphanage. They're part of this, whether they know the full story or not. From now on, you have to be even more careful. Don't let them know you're onto something. Act like nothing's changed. I will, Lily promised, though the thought of returning to the orphanage filled her with dread. Every corner seemed to hide a new danger, and now she had the proof to back up her fears. Matthew stepped closer, lowering his voice. I'm going to keep looking for more information. But Lily, if things start to feel wrong, if you feel like you're in danger, you need to find a way out. Don't wait for things to get worse. Lily nodded, her throat tight. I understand. Matthew gave her a reassuring look, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. We're close. We'll find her. Lily held onto his words, letting them sink in like a lifeline. She had come this far. She wasn't going to give up now. They parted ways shortly after, and Lily made her way back to the orphanage, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had learned. The streets felt emptier, darker, and the snow seemed to fall faster as she hurried along. By the time she reached the orphanage's back door, her fingers were numb from the cold, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too full of questions and fear. She slipped back inside and climbed the stairs to her room, doing her best to remain unnoticed. As she lay in bed that night, her thoughts kept spinning. She couldn't stop thinking about Ellie, trapped somewhere, waiting for her. The idea that her sister had been taken for something dark and secret filled her with a sense of urgency. Time was running out, and the people who had taken Ellie were still out there, pulling the strings. But as Lily lay awake in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were closer to finding her than ever before. And that meant the danger was closer too. The air inside the orphanage felt heavier than ever as Lily went about her day, pretending that nothing had changed. But inside, she was a storm of anxiety and fear. The discovery of Ellie's medical files had shifted everything, and now, knowing how dangerous the people behind it were, every moment felt like it was teetering on the edge of something catastrophic. For days, Matthew didn't contact her. The silence gnawed at her. She tried to stay focused on her routine, acting normal, but with every passing hour, the tension in her chest grew tighter. Mrs. Turner's eyes followed her everywhere, and Lily had to fight the growing paranoia that somehow she knew about the meeting in the park. It wasn't until the fourth night after giving Matthew the files that things came crashing down. Lily was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling as usual, when she heard footsteps outside her door. Not the usual creak of the floorboards when one of the girls went to the bathroom or when Mrs. Turner did her rounds. These footsteps were heavy, purposeful, and they stopped just outside her room. Her heart pounded in her chest. She lay still, her breath shallow, hoping they would move on. But they didn't. Instead, the door slowly creaked open. Lily sat up, her heart racing, and saw the silhouette of Mrs. Turner standing in the doorway, her face obscured by shadow. The cold air from the hallway rushed in, sending a chill through the room. Lily, Mrs. Turner's voice was low and sharp. Come with me. Fear gripped Lily, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't let Mrs. Turner see how terrified she was. Why? She asked, her voice steady despite the tightness in her throat. We need to have a little chat, Mrs. Turner said, stepping into the room. There are some things I've been meaning to ask you. Lily felt the walls closing in around her. She knew this was it. Mrs. Turner had found out, but she had no choice. If she resisted, it would only make things worse. Slowly, Lily climbed out of bed and followed Mrs. Turner out of the room. They walked down the dimly lit hallways of the orphanage, the silence between them thick with tension. The farther they walked, the more certain Lily became that this was a trap. Mrs. Turner wasn't taking her somewhere to talk. She was leading her into danger. When they reached the basement stairs, Lily's heart sank. Mrs. Turner stopped at the top, turning to look at her with a cold, calculating gaze. Go on, she said, motioning toward the steps. Lily hesitated, fear clawing at her throat. What are we doing down here? Just go, Mrs. Turner ordered, her voice hard as steel. You've been hiding things, Lily. It's time we cleared the air. Lily knew there was no turning back now. She took a deep breath and descended the stairs, her legs trembling as she moved deeper into the cold, dark basement. When they reached the bottom, Mrs. Turner flicked on a single bare light bulb, casting long shadows across the room. It was then that Lily saw him. Standing in the far corner, leaning against the wall, was a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with a sharp, angular face, and he watched her with dark, unsettling eyes. There was something about him that made her skin crawl. "This is Mr. Black," Mrs. Turner said, her voice unnervingly calm. "He's here to help sort out some misunderstandings." Lily's heart raced. She knew instantly that Mr. Black wasn't here to ask questions. He was here to make sure she never spoke again. Panic rose in her chest, but she forced herself to stay still, to think. "Misunderstandings?" Lily asked, trying to buy herself time. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Turner stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Don't play dumb with me, Lily. You've been meeting with someone. You've been asking too many questions. It's time to stop." Lily felt her pulse quicken. They knew everything. They knew about Matthew, about the files. She needed to get out of there, but there was no way past them. She was trapped. "You don't know what you're talking about," Lily said, her voice shaking despite her attempt to stay calm. Mrs. Turner's eyes gleamed with cold amusement. "I've been doing this a long time, Lily. I know when a child is lying. You've been digging into things that don't concern you, things that are better left alone." Mr. Black took a step forward, his eyes fixed on her like a predator watching its prey. "We don't need to make this harder than it has to be," he said, his voice deep and menacing. "Just tell us what you know. Who have you been talking to?" Lily's mind raced. She couldn't tell them about Matthew. She couldn't betray him or Ellie. She had to find a way out, but there was no escape. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and for a brief second, she considered running. But where? There was no way out of the basement except for the stairs behind her, and Mrs. Turner and Mr. Black were blocking her only exit. Suddenly, the basement door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and a figure appeared at the top. "Lily!" Matthew's voice echoed down the stairwell. Relief flooded through her, but it was quickly replaced by fear. If Matthew was here, he was in danger too. Mrs. Turner's expression hardened, and Mr. Black's hand twitched toward his coat, where Lily guessed a weapon might be hidden. "You shouldn't have come here," Mrs. Turner hissed, glaring up at Matthew. But Matthew didn't hesitate. He moved down the stairs quickly, his eyes locked on Lily. "We need to go now." Lily bolted toward him without a second thought. Mrs. Turner lunged forward to grab her, but Matthew stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Get back," he warned, his voice sharp with authority. Mr. Black took another step forward, but Matthew didn't flinch. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice cold and steady. "Walk away now, and I won't report any of this." Mrs. Turner's face twisted with fury. "You think you can threaten us? You have no idea what you're up against." Matthew glanced over his shoulder at Lily. "Run." Lily didn't need to be told twice. She turned and sprinted up the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, she heard the sound of scuffling, but she didn't stop. She burst through the basement door and into the hallway, her feet barely touching the ground as she ran toward the orphanage's back entrance. The cold night air hit her like a slap in the face, but she didn't slow down. She heard footsteps behind her and knew Matthew was right behind her, keeping pace. They didn't stop until they were several blocks away, hidden in the shadows of an alley, gasping for breath. "Are you okay?" Matthew asked, his voice breathless but urgent. Lily nodded, though her body was shaking. What now?" Matthew looked at her, his expression grim. "We have to disappear. They won't stop now. We're too close to the truth." Lily swallowed hard. She knew he was right. They couldn't go back to the orphanage. They couldn't trust anyone. But as terrifying as that realization was, she felt something else too. Relief. They were free. And wherever they went next, they would be closer to finding Ellie. As the cold wind swept through the empty streets, Lily and Matthew moved quietly through the darkness, their breath visible in the crisp night air. The orphanage was far behind them now, just a distant memory of fear and control. For the first time in months, Lily felt something new blooming inside her: hope. They hadn't spoken much since escaping the orphanage, but the weight of what had happened pressed down on both of them. Matthew led the way, his steps sure but cautious, his mind already calculating their next move. For Lily, everything felt surreal. In just a few hours, her entire world had shifted. She wasn't just a scared little girl stuck in an orphanage anymore. She was free, and she was ready to do whatever it took to find Ellie. Eventually, they reached the outskirts of the city, stopping in front of a small, run-down motel. The neon sign flickered above them, casting a dim light on the wet pavement. Matthew checked them in, using a name Lily didn't recognize, and soon they were behind the safety of a locked door. The room was shabby, with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors, but to Lily, it was a sanctuary. As she sat down on the edge of the bed, exhaustion finally caught up with her. The adrenaline that had kept her going since the basement confrontation was fading, leaving her drained and shaky. She looked over at Matthew, who was already setting up his laptop on the small desk in the corner. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Lily asked, her voice small. Matthew looked up from the screen, his expression serious but calm. "They might, but we're not going to let them find us. We'll stay ahead of them." Lily nodded, trusting him. Matthew had always seemed calm under pressure, but now that they were on the run, she realized how much they were depending on each other. She had no one left in the world but him and Ellie. The thought of her sister, somewhere out there, kept her grounded, kept her determined. "We're close, Lily," Matthew said, as if reading her thoughts. "I've been piecing together what I can from the files. Whatever your father was involved in, it ties directly to Ellie's disappearance. This was bigger than we thought." Lily swallowed hard. Do you think she's okay? Wherever she is." Matthew paused, then met her gaze. "I do. And I think she's waiting for you." The warmth of those words soothed Lily, but there was still a lingering fear she couldn't shake. She had seen the lengths these people would go to keep their secrets buried. She had heard the threats. But despite all that, the fear no longer paralyzed her. It drove her. "Where do we go next?" she asked, leaning forward. Matthew glanced at his laptop, scrolling through documents and emails. "There's a lead in a small town a few hours from here. A facility that was shut down years ago. A place that matches the location mentioned in Ellie's medical files. I think it's where they took her." Lily's heart quickened. "And you think she's there?" Matthew sighed. "I don't know for sure, but it's our best shot. If she's not there, someone will know where they moved her." "We're getting closer." Lily stood up and crossed the room to stand next to Matthew. She looked at the screen, at the maps and notes that covered it, feeling a strange mix of fear and excitement. "We'll find her," Lily said, her voice full of quiet conviction. "We have to." Matthew smiled, a small but genuine smile that made Lily feel just a little bit lighter. "We will." And as they prepared to leave, the weight of the journey ahead settled over them both. There were still so many questions unanswered, so many dangers lurking in the shadows. But for the first time in a long time, Lily didn't feel alone. She had someone fighting by her side, and together, they would face whatever was coming. As they stepped back into the cold night, Lily couldn't help but think of Ellie. Somewhere out there, her sister was waiting, and soon, Lily would find her. The world had tried to bury the truth, but Lily had uncovered it, and she wasn't going to stop until they were reunited. No matter how far she had to go,